Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Well, good evening. We continue our series with conflict in communities of faith and the church. Now, what happens when deep differences in theology, politics, or identity turn into divisions of communities of faith? What initiates and fuels division? And what conversations can build connection and care in the midst of profound differences? In this episode, Sexual Orientation, Conversations that Strengthen Community in Challenging Times, we will discuss rebuilding relationships by enhancing conversation with lessons and tips from the reflective, structured dialogue approach of the Public Conversations Project. Now, the Public Conversations Project, I'll shorten it to PCP, has been working successfully with deeply divided communities of faith at local, national, and international levels for the past 20 years. Our special guest is Bob Staines. Now, he is the Senior Vice President for Training at the Public Conversations Project near Boston, Massachusetts. And for the past 20 years, Bob has created constructive conversations on divisive theological and identity issues in all arenas. He is a frequent conference and university speaker and provides consultation to academic, civic, and religious leaders in the U.S. and abroad. Bob consults to the Harvard Negotiation Project and is a guest scholar practitioner for Kansas State University's Dialogue, Deliberation, and Public Engagement project. Now, tonight we have a number of things that we are doing to get you involved. So we have our chat room open, and thank you for those guests who have already joined us there. You can simply go to blogtalkradio.com/Texas-conflict-coach, and we encourage you to leave your comments and questions, and we'll bring them into the conversation. Second, we are also running a Twitter feed. Our graduate students are working away tonight, so thank you for that. Use our hashtag TCCRadio, and our Twitter handle is TXConflictCoach. And also we have PC Conversations, who is also Twittering with us. So that is Twitter handle PC Conversations, and they'll be engaging with us as well. So, Bob, thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking for quite some time now, so I'm glad that the time has arrived.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege and a treat to be here, and looking forward to talking with you.
Well, no problem. And so let's talk about what's brought you here, but more specifically, we'll kick off with just kind of what's motivating you to do the work that you do and what is exciting about it, because every time you talk about this topic with me, you're so passionate about it. So tell me a little bit about that, how you got started.
Well, I'll tell you there are sort of many ways, but I'll give you just 2 points. One is an experience I had when I was a kid. And I was at a friend of mine's house. I was about 9 years old. We were playing hockey in his backyard. We came in for hot chocolate. And his dad reached across the table to get something, and I noticed there were numbers on his arm. And I didn't know what that meant, so I went home and asked my dad. And my dad told me that his father had been in a concentration camp during the Holocaust and told me about that horrible time. And told me how Hitler used language and labeling to dehumanize a group of people, and it became a real concern of mine for the rest of my life. So that was an early motivation, but now what keeps me doing the work that I do is a tremendous opportunity to see the changes that people experience when they participate in dialogue. When people come together and they absolutely cannot imagine having a constructive conversation with somebody that they really, really deeply differ with. And they're sort of shocked and surprised and gratified that they can do this, not just that they can have a conversation, but that they can make a deep connection with somebody that they really differ with. And I'm telling you, that makes it for me.
Well, okay, so you brought the word up, dialogue, because I know that word actually kind of gets tossed around a lot, and then constructive conversation. So can you just clarify for our listening audience, when you say dialogue, especially in terms of Public Conversations Project, what does that mean to y'all?
So for us, dialogue is a conversation for the purpose of deepening understanding among people who differ. And in our realm, it's about deep identity, religious, and values issues. And for us, you mentioned the term reflective, structured dialogue. So dialogue is a conversation with a form to it. It involves a reflective process of trying to understand better where you're coming from and where the other's coming from, a structured process of engagement, so that people know what to expect, and a process that's guided by agreements or covenants for how people are going to behave toward each other. But the core of it is a conversation for the purpose of understanding rather than debate, rather than persuasion, etc.
Okay, perfect. Okay, that's what I wanted to see, because it's very purposeful, the use of the word dialogue, and as you said, reflective, structured dialogue. Now, actually, why don't we step back and say a little bit more about the Public Conversations Project, and then we're going to delve right into our topic of sexual orientation as an identity issue in the communities of faith. But talk a little bit about the Public Conversations Project.
Sure. Public Conversations began 25 years ago as an experiment in a family therapy training institute to see if family therapy ideas could help people have better conversations about very hard public issues like abortion. And what started as an experiment has evolved into a methodology that's now used around the world. We work in the U.S., and we do significant work in Africa as well. And we work in all different contexts, helping people to have conversations that are going to bridge differences that will enable them, in many cases, to restore bonds of trust, restore connection, and be able to work together more effectively. And obviously this has particular meaning and usefulness in the context of the church and individual communities of faith.
Okay, so that's a good segue into what we're talking about for not only this whole series in February, but in particular what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's talk about why is it tough to talk about sexual orientation in particular as it relates to the church and church community.
Well, there are a whole universe of reasons why it's tough, but I'll give you a couple. First is just these are tender issues. These are issues that cut to the heart of folks' identity. And I think on the side of faith, a lot of times folks don't realize how one's faith commitment is really at the core of one's identity for many people. And when talking about something that threatens that faith commitment, it can be really upsetting and difficult to have that conversation. On the other side, when you're talking about sexual orientation, it's also right at the heart of one's identity. So in the wonderful book, Difficult Conversations, Stone, Patton, and Heen talk about the three conversations that we have when we're talking about tough things. There's the what happened conversation, the how I felt about a conversation, and the what it says about my identity conversation. And they tell us that last piece, the what it says about my identity conversation that I maybe even having just in my head, is the place where people really get tripped up when we imagine that this is impacting our identity in some way and we feel threatened. And that's the constant that we see in the work that we do, that folks are in a state where they feel that their identity is in some way threatened by folks on the other side. And in that environment, we start behaving in fairly predictable ways because we're neurophysiologically stimulated, and we start responding in maybe defensive or aggressive ways that provoke the other person to respond in a similar way, and we're kind of off to the races.
All right, so now we talk this language a lot, about the threat to our identity and self, but let's go a little bit deeper for the listening audience. We might assume that they understand what we're really talking about. So when you talk about identity, say more about what that really means.
So identity is how we define ourselves. It's the things about us that we consider to be the most central to us. So, and when they're questioned, it can be a real, very difficult thing. I'll give you an example. For me, my identity is very tied up in being a father. Being a father is like right at the top of the heap there, along with being a husband. And when there was somebody in my life when my children were younger that used to be fairly critical of my parenting and give me advice, somebody who didn't have kids. And I really felt that there was a comment being made about my identity as a parent. And it was very, very difficult for me to listen in that situation and not to get defensive. So whatever we construe to be really close to the heart for us is our identity.
Okay, so I'm going to bring something up that's coming up for me, and let's see how this ties into the religious identity, especially the sexual orientation piece. So there's two examples that I have experienced either with friends, family, or colleagues, and I won't name any names or anything of that nature. The two scenarios have been someone who's very, very committed to their religion. We'll say Christianity, okay? Very tied to their identity as a Christian. I'm a Christian. And they say that I go to church, and so their identity is very, very tied to that commitment. And this same person who has very strong Christian faith and identity is also struggling with his or her own sexual identity, knowing that they're probably either gay or lesbian, but struggling with identity because of their Christian beliefs. That's one scenario. The second is that they're not struggling with their sexual identity. They are proud to be, let's say, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. They also have a strong faith, but the other people in the Christian religion or in the church will question their identity because it's a sin, and so there's that challenge, that threat. So those are two examples that I've encountered in my life with friends, colleagues, family, etc., that has come up and has caused a great deal of conflict. And so I'm thinking that you're talking about why this is a really tough topic, especially around sexual orientation.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you've named some of the really frequent comments of folks when we get involved in communities where this issue is at the fore. It's core, it's tender, and the other interesting thing I think about this is that people often come with an idea about who the other person is that's really not accurate. And it leads into one of the other dynamics of what keeps things going as they go, that people are quite certain about the other. And what we can do is create an opportunity for folks to get really curious and learn what it means for the person to treasure the identity that they do.
So when you now one of the things that you do, meaning PCP and yourself, is how you provide these opportunities using this structured dialogue, this methodology, especially, like you said, in deeply divided communities of faith at all kinds of levels, whatever the faith might be. And so what are some of the cautions and or the invitations to start having these conversations, especially when you're working in these communities?
I think the caution is to be sure that you really want to have dialogue, because a lot of times we'll get approached by folks that think that they want to have dialogue, but what they really want to do is convert the other person to their way of thinking. They want to use, they want an opportunity for debate or persuasion. And there are really great processes for that, and we can refer people to folks that do those processes. But dialogue is not that. So, really being clear that the dialogue and mutual understanding is at the core. That's really the biggest, I think, caution. We are very, very careful and cautious in our approach. About 80% of our work is done in advance. So by the time people come into the room, most of the things that we might be concerned about have been addressed. On the other hand, the invitations are, just manifold. The first is that people discover things about the other that they never knew, and they're surprised and they're pleased. I just did facilitated a dialogue on this subject in a conservative religious organization. And at the end, one of the people turned to another and said, I've known you for 35 years, but I realized I never really knew you. That opportunity is incredible, and it really shakes up and makes community feel very, very new. People leaving with new ways to talk about difference. Now, not just with people that they're opposed to in church, but at home with their families, at work. Wherever they find themselves using the things that they experienced and learned in dialogue. And probably, for me, one of the biggest things is to see people getting curious about one another. They're dropping their certainty and really getting interested in the life of the other person and finding that returned. And that builds connections that go far beyond the dialogue room.
I love that. Some really great invitations there, like you said. I mean, especially once that structure is put into place, because as you mentioned going back, that 80% of the work that y'all are doing with them individually, separately, is done in advance. And let me just stop here for just a second, just let people know that you are tuned in and listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program, and we are talking with Bob Staines with the Public Conversations Project, in particular on a number of things around reflective structured dialogue, especially in regards to very difficult conversations that pertain to the sense of identity. So let's pick back up, because when you talk about that 80% of the work is done, what would be example of what this work is? And you say that because the caution is the people who are coming to you who say, we really want your help, and you're really questioning, is this really what you want? I would imagine some of that pre-advanced work really gets clarity for them. Is this what they really want to do? So say more about that advanced level work you're doing first.
A couple of levels to that. One is what we would call mapping the situation. So we would want to talk to numbers of different people from different positions, sectors, et cetera, to learn what the needs really are and what the hopes are. And it's at that level that we begin to get a sense of, is this a dialogue project or is this another kind of project? So we did a large piece of work for the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh a couple of years ago. It was a dialogue project for the entire diocese, and we started out by talking with 20 key people to learn what the history of the conflict was, where things had gone well, where they hadn't, what they hoped for, and what they were worried about. Out of that, we discerned together with the planning team that dialogue was a good idea, and we started to create a model that was going to meet their needs. Once we know who participants are going to be, we're usually selected by a local group, whether it's in a church or in a larger religious body. We want to talk with them for about an hour, and we want to learn their experience of this particular conflict and how their life experience is related to it, and ask them questions that invite them to go sort of deeply and widely into their experience, into their concerns, into their hopes, and then get their ideas for what would make for a good meeting. And then we incorporate what we hear and their ideas into our planning process of actually planning dialogue sessions. One key part of that is listening to the kinds of behavioral agreements that could be present that would help people feel safe enough to speak. And then creating a set of those agreements, running them by everybody in advance, and getting sign-off so that when we come into the room, everybody knows that they're in covenant with each other already. So that's all the preliminary stuff. And
that's a lot of work that you're doing ahead of time.
It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it's wonderful work. But it really does make for a very, very different conversation. One more thing I'd just add is thinking about we think a lot about sort of how people enter the room in a situation like this as part of the pre-planning, and one of the things we try to do is see if we can have people enter with a meal first, so that they're eating together before they're speaking. That's it. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. I was actually looking at the Twitter feed, and some of the conversation was going on there, and some of the work that y'all do around identity, could be around same-sex marriage, immigration, abortion, diversity. I mean, it's a very broad range of the things that you do, especially when it pertains to difficult conversations around our sense of who we are and our identity. So it was interesting to kind of read that in the Twitter feed that's going on right now. So I appreciate people sharing that. So a lot of work going on to establish a safe place to talk, to be able to set up a successful dialogue session that is with the goal of deepening understanding, with the idea of inviting discovery, inviting a place for people to really listen in new ways so that they can talk about their differences in new ways, and to really set up that place of curiosity. And so I can understand where all that amount of work that y'all are doing with individuals, and like you said, mapping the situation, getting their input on what would make a good meeting, having these behavior, all of those things with the idea of, like you said, making it dynamic and also trying to restore connections and trust. And it's not about, like you said, debating, having them, convince the other people, to change their ways or to persuade or debate. So say more about is there any hopes that you have as the facilitator of what you think you're trying to do at the end, other than trying to bridge these connections? Is there any more further that you would like to say about what you're trying to get from these dialogues, with, especially around the sexual orientation and identity issues?
Well, maybe I can just tell you a little vignette that might illustrate what I hope to see more of as we do this work. And it actually comes from my first experience working on this topic back in 1997. I was working with two national leaders of a religious organization, and we were actually having preliminary conversations before a dialogue was planned. And one man, a conservative, very conservative man, spoke of how he came to his position because his brother was gay and his brother had died of AIDS, and he wanted to make sure that more people did not die of AIDS. And the other man on the progressive side, who was gay, talked about having a partner for 20 years and describing himself as a widower and living with the grief of losing his lifelong partner. So these two men looked at each other, and they both had gay people that were very, very close to them. And they could relate to each other in their loss. And one man looked at the other and said, I hate how you think, but I love you. That, to me, tells me what the possibility is for dialogue. And the more we do this, the more we bring that into the world, the better place the world's going to be.
It's like opening that door ever so slowly, to have that in and having that conversation. what's coming up for me is when you're doing all this work to set this structured dialogue in place to create this safe space, when people leave the dialogue, and I don't know if the dialogue is like one long day or if it's, you have multiple sessions. I'm not clear. The listener quite understands, if that, and you can certainly clarify. But once your role is done as the facilitator or whatever you might call yourself in facilitating those dialogues, what do they walk away with that allows them to continue those types of dialogues so that they have some strategy or skill moving forward to continue those kinds of dialogues, even if it's a whole another topic?
Sure. Well, typically we do not just parachute in, do the work, and leave. We come by invitation, and we are invited by usually a local group, whether that's a church or a denomination, and we work with a planning team wherever we go. And that planning team then becomes the central point of connection for folks after we leave. And oftentimes we'll train people how to carry the dialogue forward after we're gone. We just finished a project actually in Montana around the gun issue, where we trained pro-gun and pro-gun legislation activists and advocates to go out in mixed facilitator teams and facilitate conversations about guns. And they'll go throughout the state and do that. So typically we like to find a way to leave capacity behind, whether it's what the planning team is going to do next or us actually training people to perpetuate the dialogue process.
Okay, good. Thank you and I like your analogy of parachuting in and then all of a sudden you're gone and they're like, now what? Right. So I appreciate the fact that you really build that in capacity for them to continue on, either with that ongoing conversation or if other heated topics come up that they are able to continue and use a structure that they've learned.
Can I just shoehorn one quick thing in, Patty?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to address your question about duration, our dialogue work can be anything from a 3-hour evening to multiple sessions over weeks, months, and years. It depends on the needs of where we go. So go ahead.
Okay. And you work a lot internationally, so you have. Are there teams that live abroad, or are you mostly housed in Boston and send people out that way? Because if you're working with multiple sessions over a long period of time, I imagine that you have some folks embedded in different places in other countries.
Right now we do in Nigeria. We are very fortunate to work with the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, which is right on the border between North and South. The Interfaith Mediation Center helps Christians and Muslims have constructive conversations, and we've been teaching there for a number of years. We have a person on the ground there. We're in partnership with UMass Graduate School of Dispute Resolution in helping those folks, helping their staff learn and practice dialogue skills. So in that sense, yes, we do have somebody on the ground, but we also, one of our colleagues, Dave Joseph, travels there regularly to train the staff and give advice and consultation to the folks that are running the program there.
Okay, very, very
mostly
good.
We're based in Boston.
Okay, that's good to know because y'all are very international, especially if you're doing very long-term work. I can imagine that it's great that you have that partnership that you do there. Something that keeps coming back for me, and I want to go back to, and that was the initial caution about, do people really want to have dialogue? Have you had situations where people are like, we want dialogue, but once you get into the mapping and getting the ideas, you realize this is really not a dialogue project? Has that happened?
Yeah, it has. Very rarely, I have to say, and certainly as we have grown, our reputation has grown over the years. It's less and less so because by the time people get to us, they've usually been referred by somebody who has used our services. So they have a pretty good sense of what we stand for. But it does come up every so often.
And I imagine a lot of it has to do with education, just educating them about what it is that you're about and what it is that they're really trying to do. So I was curious, especially when you made that cautious remark, how much education you have to do before you can move forward with mapping and everything. So
I think that the education that we do have to do is to define what dialogue means. Just as you asked in the beginning, you said there's so many meanings to it, and people do come with other meanings. Like it could be folks we do a lot of work in academic institutions, and their dialogue tends to mean discussion of a topic. So we have to talk with them. Well, that's not exactly what we're about here. So there is a process of clarification that has to go on.
Okay, very good. Now, we're going to be shifting into closing the program, and I know we could talk for a long time about the work that you do, and we'll also talk about how people can find out more about you and any training that if they're interested in learning how to do these types of reflective structured dialogues. What tips or strategies, for folks who are really listening, because one of the things that we talk about in this work is the things that initiate and fuel division. So are there any immediate things that come to mind in the work that you do that would be helpful to listeners right now?
I think, excuse me, I heard a sermon one time, a long time ago, and the minister was saying that questions are gifts. And offering the gift of questions to people that we're speaking with, whether it's family, friends, or folks that we're close to or opposed to in our religious institutions, is one of the most powerful things I think that we can do. To really get curious and use our questions to enable people to talk about what matters to them is one of the quickest and deepest ways of creating connection between people. So that would be the biggest tip that I'd leave.
Okay, very good. And also in a very genuine way, to start
Absolutely.
Ever so slowly opening the door.
Yeah, not questions that are designed to instruct or unmask or whatever, but questions that really show that you're interested in the person that you're speaking with.
Okay, very good. All right, so now as we begin to close the program, we always give some type of assignment for the week or call to action. So what do you have for our listeners tonight?
Well, there we go. It's very similar to what I was just talking about. I would challenge you to connect with somebody that you really differ with on something that's important to you. And rather than asserting your point of view, just listen. And only ask questions that will invite your speaking partner to say more about what really matters to them. Okay.
Very, very good. And listeners, what I want you to do, if you decide that you would like to share the experience, you can certainly share that with Bob and the PC Conversations. How would you like them to do that? How would you like the listeners to contact you and engage with you?
I think if they wanted to go through Twitter, that would be fine.
Okay, and so again, for Twitter with PC, it's actually it's P Conversations. I kept saying PC Conversations. There's only one C, so it's P Conversations is your Twitter handle, and or TX Conflict Coach, and you can certainly share your experience there. But how else can they find information about Public Conversations Project?
They can go to our wonderful website, publicconversations.org, and there's two C's in the middle there. And there are a couple places that I would recommend people to go for more information. And there's a resources section that has books and guides and things like that, which are fabulous. And there's a video series, a 12-session video-based training series on dialogue that's specifically created for churches and other nonprofits that don't have enough money to send people to training. I would look in the resources section for that. And the other thing that I would ask people to check out is the workshops. We offer trainings that folks really get a lot out of, if I do say so myself. And I encourage people to take a look at that.
Now, the workshops, just to clarify, is that for them to learn how to facilitate these reflective structured dialogues, or?
Yeah, we actually are going to be starting some personal skill development workshops later in the year. Right now in the spring, however, all of our workshops are oriented around folks that want to learn about the dialogue model and who want to enhance their facilitation skill.
All right, but you do offer training from both the individual skill-based perspective, their own personal development, and those who are very interested in doing this work as a facilitator.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so Bob, I really want to thank you so much for being on the Texas Conflict Coach and having this conversation with us. Your website, which is a new website, and I love it, is a wealth of information and great resources, as you mentioned. And so I'm looking forward to looking more on the site, but also you're coming to Texas to do some workshops here in Texas. So are there workshops that are public workshops that people can attend? Because that's just in a next week, actually.
Sure. Well, there is a workshop I'm giving in Austin on February 18th. It's called Dialogic Tools for Facilitation Challenges, and it's for facilitators that it's for those moments as a facilitator when you have a deer in the headlights moment where you have a challenge that's come up and you don't quite know what to do. I call them mortifying moments. And we'll be talking about how to work with those and how to develop a thinking strategy in advance that might prevent some of those from happening.
Okay, very good.
In Austin.
And they can find that on the website if they're in the area or they want to register for that.
Yep, I think we have space for about 2 or 3 more people. So
okay, so it's almost a filled workshop. Very good. Well, again, thank you so much, and I'm going to leave you with the final word. So what final message would you like to leave with our listeners tonight?
Well, I think this really goes out to the folks that are in churches. That I think there is great wisdom to be had in the Scriptures that relates to what we're just talking about, and that is that we're really created to be different. There's wonderful passages in Corinthians about the body and how we need the toes and we need the hands and we need the ears. And I think the more we live like that in our religious communities, the better off we'll be. And the last thing I would say is that one of the things that folks discover in dialogue is the truth of the passage that we see through a glass darkly now, as it says in Corinthians. That we don't have a lock on the total truth. We never will until we get to glory, as they say. If we keep those things in mind in our communities of faith, I think we can work through a lot of the differences that we have.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you all the listeners who are in our chat room and our Twitter feed and listening to this podcast. And thank you again, Bob, for joining us tonight.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks so much, Patty. Have a good night.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.